Welcome again, folks, to the Washington Babylon podcast with Ken Silverstein. So, Ken, here we are. We're starting off 2020. What are your thoughts going into this new year?
My thoughts going into this new year are my usual thoughts. I'm pessimistic, I'm sorry to say.
So today we have on for our guest, Sherrie André. They are a radical environmental and immigration solidarity activist based in Providence. I've been reporting on the actions of their group, the Fan Collective, over the course of the year, and their struggles with this really nasty Trumpkin of a sheriff named Thomas Hodgson.
Well, I'm looking forward to the conversation, so let's get to Sherrie. Sherrie, thanks for joining us today for the Washington Babylon podcast. I wanted to talk to you about your experiences protesting against ICE, but before getting started, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about yourself, your political history. How did you get involved with the Fan Collective? And well, why don't we just start from there before talking about the protest specifically?
Okay, great. I am a Southeast Asian and Puerto Rican queer person who started organizing pretty young. I don't know that I would have called it organizing or engaging in politics, but my family is mixed status, and I think coming from that background of folks of color, we have always tried to take care of each other and take care of our community and find ways to create resources outside of what the government provides, or quote unquote provides us, so that we can be self-sufficient. So I think that's mostly where my start came from. My mother's from Thailand and my father's from Puerto Rico, and like fully believe that Puerto Rico should be its own independent space, separate from the United States, and feel that both places, because of the Vietnam War and just like continuous U.S. presence in Puerto Rico, have been impacted by U.S. imperialism. And so just have very strong feelings about that, and got my start with the Fan Collective because I was originally working as a domestic violence and sexual assault advocate for various populations of people, but mostly undocumented women and Indigenous women, and started to see this connection between climate change and what was happening within our shelters. I was working in a shelter in South Dakota where people were starting to get ready for the Keystone XL, and not just get ready for the environmental impacts of the Keystone XL, but the social impacts, such as an influx of male workers setting up a man camp outside of tribal housing. And what would that do for the resources that were available for people on the reservation, whether it be domestic violence shelters and sexual assault shelters, because the rates of sexual assault increase around man camps, as well as rates of drug usage and alcohol usage for various reasons, like such as the workers need to stay up for long hours and have their own poor working conditions. But there is a correlation between those impacts. And so came back home and wanted to see what those impacts were like here. We don't necessarily have fracking in Rhode Island, but we do benefit from, quote unquote, again, benefit from fracking being done in the shale fields of Pennsylvania. About like 99% of our energy comes from fracked gas. And so wanted to see how we were connected, and also wanted to see what these social costs were here, because man camps don't look the same on the East Coast as they do in the Midwest. And so, yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what camps don't look the same?
Man camps is what they're called, which are large, usually, well, in the Midwest, they just look like miles of trailers that can house up to many thousands of men who are there to work on frac gas infrastructure or fracking. And here on the East Coast, it doesn't look exactly like that. Sometimes it looks like entire campgrounds being rented out or hotels being rented out so that they have a place to live. And and so started the FANG Collective to kind of organize at these intersections where we're really being mindful that we are not just trying to fight climate change by fighting these infrastructure projects and fracking, but we're also addressing, or at least bringing to light, these social costs. How are these infrastructure projects actually impacting communities in a different way, such as sometimes people are resisting these projects and sometimes people within their family support them. And so just even at the, I don't even say this is a bare minimum, but a bare minimum, just family division and the stress that that causes people when they're fighting these projects. So that's mostly where I got my start and how FANG came to be. I don't know if you have any other questions about that, but that's I tried to keep it short, but it was still felt really long. I'm sorry.
No, that's perfect. And you're involved in various issues, it sounds like. As I understand it, you you're deeply involved in the immigration issue, correct?
Yeah. Yes, FANG has currently.
Specifically, your. I want to talk about the charges you're facing, but how did you get involved in that issue, or has that always been part of your work?
That's always been part of our work, but maybe not something that has been part of our open narrative to people who've been following our work through social media or on our website, because the people within the organization are people of color, children of undocumented people, children from other mixed status families, queer and trans people. I think we have always organized with this intersectional perspective or approach, but hasn't always been at the forefront of our narrative. And once it became part of that, once we started to openly express, like we had this active campaign called Shut Down ICE, targeting prisons that have 287G and IGSA agreements, we started to see just this shift in how environmentalists responded to our work. People who were so happy that we would fight frac gas infrastructure projects in their communities started to troll us and leave negative comments. And it's really been a shift in just how I have started to view my work. We've always had to address people's inability to acknowledge environmental racism within our work, but just this, this feeling of we must fight climate change where we are fighting these projects so that we can have a quote-unquote, again, safe community and not be afraid of dying because these projects are going to explode or whatever people are concerned about, which are very real and valid. But if we fight these projects and these projects aren't built in your community and you're still racist, I don't know that I feel safe. I don't feel that I actually want a campaign. And so I feel that is more work that we need to do as an organization to address this disconnection between what people actually think is a, safer, and I should say safer with the caveat that I know that there are various people with various gender and racial identities who may never feel safe, but safer in a way that, we might fight the bad of these structures, these infrastructures, but we're actually addressing the bad within ourselves.
Okay, this is interesting. I have a few follow-up questions, and I want to make sure I understand you. First off, you mentioned a couple of terms that I'm familiar with because I've covered immigration, but I'm not sure everyone will know. Which were the 287s and the IGSA agreements. Can you talk a little? What exactly are those? I mean, these were issues that you were taking on. I mean, I'm interested in hearing about how it sounds like some of the people who were with you on climate change or environmental issues were not with you on immigration issues. Is that correct?
Yes, definitely people outside of our organization who had in the past supported our work when we were just solely expressing vocally our work about fighting these infrastructure projects. And I guess to answer your question, specifically, we started off targeting prisons that had have something called a 287G agreement. And these agreements are contracts that police departments, through the agreement with the sheriff, can make with ICE. And that, in turn, deputizes these sheriffs to then essentially act as ICE officers. They can then arrest and detain people and hold them for ICE until they are then deported. And the reason why we started targeting these that have these particular agreements is because before the Wyatt Detention Center had opened in Rhode Island, people from Rhode Island were being detained and held in these facilities in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. And so for us, it was, how do we address this immediate issue where these police departments are allowed to do this? And it was something as simple as they just don't have to have these agreements. These agreements can end at any time. These contracts could end at any time. We don't have to wait until a year passed from the signing on to these agreements for us to not have them anymore. And it's also, we had particularly targeted the Bristol County House of Corrections because that was a facility that we had could identify where a lot of community members were being held and detained, but also because they have one of the worst. I mean, I don't think prisons should exist, and I don't think these positions should exist, but has one of the worst sheriffs, Sheriff Hodgson, who essentially runs a facility. Yeah, who essentially runs a facility where there's high rates of suicide, high rates of solitary confinement. People have written to us letting us know that they haven't had access to their medication and just the general conditions of the facility. And so for us, a lot of people don't realize that we're not just targeting a detention facility, we're targeting a prison. And for us, that's really important.
So why, though, still, I'm curious, why did people, what sort of reaction did you get from people who had been backing you on environmental issues? Why was it that they bailed when it came to immigration? I mean, what caused them to drop out of supporting that work? I mean, I think you were suggesting that it was an issue that didn't affect them directly, if I was understanding you correctly. I mean, but why would, what caused this split?
I think we're at an interesting time where people are starting to believe that climate change is real and are still not releasing themselves from this internalized or even, enacted racism that they hold within themselves. They refuse to acknowledge that. And I remember we had been working in a particular community helping them fight an infrastructure project, and you drive around the election time and you would see, like, we don't want this infrastructure project signs next to Trump signs, right? And so not really fully understanding the scope of where this, how deeply rooted climate change is interconnected with white supremacy. And I think that's really interesting. And like I said, I just think there's a lot of work to be done about around education and supporting people in understanding that, you know, there are many elements that cause climate change, but also one of them is capitalism and who holds the majority of the world's wealth and how these corporations stay in power. And, you know, we have essentially a capitalist as a president. So I think, yeah, I don't know what the entire, the best answer for that is, but I think it's people are still not able to acknowledge these internal struggles that they have within themselves and are working actively to dismantle them. And I think that's work that we all have to do, including myself. I think that's work that we just need to be mindful of. And also I think people always have approached environmental work from this, you know, NIMBY or not in my backyard mindset, which is still, you know, racist and classist. And I don't know how to fight all of the things, but I think that's something that I hope to do more work on going forward.
Right, and you see them as being connected issues, I think is what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me about your specific case. I mean, you, as I understand it, if I've got this correct, are facing charges stemming from a protest in Massachusetts last August. What was that action about? You were, I think you were targeting an ICE facility, but what was that about? And what are the consequences you're facing at this point?
Right now, well, yes, last August, I participated in an action with 4 other individuals where we blocked the exits and entrances of the Bristol County House of Corrections, which is a prison that has a 287G agreement, and this facility is in North Dartmouth, Massachusetts.
So just so listeners are clear, so it's got a 287G, so that means it's holding people for ICE. It's holding people and turning them over to ICE. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm. All right. I just wanted to make sure I was clear on that and listeners were clear on that.
Yes, for sure. Sorry. Thank you for clearing that up. And so I personally climbed up a 26-foot pole structure called a tripod, which essentially looks like a camera tripod, and was there for a little while before the police came and violently removed one of my co-defendants, who was also in a structure. They slammed her body into the ground from 26 feet and let these metal poles fall onto her body. And they did the same to me after we told them that we told them prior that they would harm us, and they expressed that, you know, then they'll hurt us. They didn't really care at all, which in general is kind of interesting to see because, you know, there was press there. There were people filming them and taking pictures of them, but they had no problem physically harming us in front of all of these people that I can only imagine what they're doing to people within the facility. And once they removed me, once they brought me down, they utilized pain compliance to try to remove me from the rest of my structure, and eventually arrested me. And 2 other people were holding down the back, one of the back exits, and they were also arrested. And we were brought to the Ash Street Jail in New Bedford, where we were there for most of the night and were released early morning on personal recognizance and arraigned the next morning. the court process has been really interesting. We've seen mostly Judge Rayburn, who has her own history. She originally did not accept the prosecution's original plea deal, which was a 6-month probationary period with community service. She thought that we should have a harsher punishment with restitution.
Mm-hmm.
And so we went back and forth to court for a long time and eventually were sentenced to 10 days in jail with the option to go to trial. And so 2 of my co-defendants accepted the 10-day jail sentence and have already served their time. And the third co-defendant was charged the entire $3,000 in restitution and a suspended sentence. And I'm the only one left who is choosing to go to trial. And I will be fighting a trespassing charge, which carries up to 30 days in jail, and a disturbing the peace charge, which carries a $150 fine.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to ask you about Sheriff Hodgson, but before getting there, why is it that you're? And I'm not challenging you on this at all, but why are you? I'm curious. Why are you deciding to go to trial rather than take a plea deal? You said the other people involved have taken a deal, and so you must have decided that you wanted to take a stand on this issue. I'm presuming, but I wanted to hear what you had to say about that, because you're going ahead and going to trial where the outcome could be worse for you, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I am not certain how it'll work out for me. But I feel like if we lose, or I lose, I will end up in jail anyway, so why not try to fight?
Mm-hmm.
And I think my other co-defendants made their own choices as to why they took those deals based on where they're at personally in their lives and their needs. And so I totally respect that and want to acknowledge that if anybody's planning on doing these things, that people should do whatever feels best for them. When it comes down to taking a deal, because, they dragged this out for over a year, and I fortunately have a lot of support and have been able to get to all of my court dates, whereas I can understand why somebody would take a deal if they didn't have access to resources. So, again, just want to acknowledge that privilege that I have. But for me, it's another opportunity to continue to bring to light what is happening within that facility, even if it's to document it and continue to raise awareness about these 287G agreements and Sheriff Hodgson and this particular facility. And I just wanted to, like I said, just use this opportunity to hopefully at least educate more people on what's happening either here or bring awareness to people that there might be a 287G contract at a prison near you. And there are various ways to take action. People don't have to do what I did, but hopefully people will be activated to do something. And
right.
Yeah, and for me, it felt like the right thing to do. And originally, when I agreed to go to trial, the restitution was still a potential part of the sentencing, and I don't personally believe in paying restitution to the police. So that was more of a value thing for me. But I also understand why people would do that. Going to court again for over a year, many years is not something that's easy.
Right. So tell us a little bit about the specific problems at this institution. I've been to a few ICE facilities, and I know the 2 I've been to personally, I've read about lots of them, have numerous problems. What are the particular problems at the facility you were protesting at? And tell us a little bit about Sheriff Hodgson, who sounds like a real piece of work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've received letters and documentation from folks within the detention facility who are being detained there, and also people who are in who are being held in incarceration there, that essentially, like I said, they're not being given prescribed medications that they need for severe illnesses or mental health concerns, which is really, really concerning. That people are not having access to, affordable phone calls, that the charges for phone calls are ridiculous and they're not able to contact family or community, that people are not able to afford the things in commissary or have access to things inside commissary, that people, experience a lot of verbal abuse from the people within the prison guards within the facility as well. Prison in itself is just not meant to be something that's rehabilitating, right? It's something that is meant to be, the system wants it to be punishing. So it sounds like there are levels of extremes where people are being held in solitary confinement, not having access to, menstruation products, or monthly bleeding products. Just basic necessities people cannot have. There isn't a way for people to cook food, even if they were to purchase it from the commissary. We have some letters that were released to us that are published online as well, if people are interested in seeing more specifics. And at the time of my action, there was...
Sorry to interrupt you, but where online can we find those?
FANG has a website, thefangcollective.org, and we also have a website called shutdownicenow.org, which has information about 287G agreements as well, if people are interested.
Okay.
But during the time of my action, folks in detention were on hunger strike, and also those who were incarcerated also went on a hunger strike in solidarity with them. And so this was not only to address all of those other concerns, but also just the fact that people weren't having access to healthy food or anything that would help sustain energy while they're in the facility.
Right.
Yeah.
And
so,
sorry.
Go ahead. No, I was just going to transition.
Okay. Can you tell us, tell us a little bit about Sheriff Hodgson? I know, I've read bits and pieces about him in the media. I know that he, I believe when he was at the White House, I could be wrong about this, but I know he's visited the White House at least once, I think several times. He's a close ally of President Trump on immigration. I know he offered to send local inmates to help build the wall. And I was wondering if there was anything else about this guy. To say he's a hardliner on immigration sounds like it would be understating the case. But I think you mentioned earlier that the facility in Bristol County has very high rates of suicide. It sounds like he is cooperating very, very actively with the federal government on the detention of immigrants and detention and deportation of asylum seekers and immigrants. Can you tell us a little bit more about him?
Sure. You also touched on a lot of just the general information about this man. I don't know, it's just so strange. Like, he's very certain that he's following the law and being really cognizant of the ways in which he should uphold the law. And it just is so confusing to me that he, as a policy, he is making decisions on policy. He's agreeing to these 287G agreements for his facility. And there have been community groups who have been telling him that they do not want these agreements for many years. And he has such a strong opinion about protesters. He has, essentially insinuated on radio that he has weapons and he knows how to use them after my action, and encouraging other people to use violence towards us if they ever, come across us in a protest. He has a lot of opinions on what is like the best way to protest or bring attention to an issue, but he continues to ignore the community that he serves. And I don't know if folks are aware that New Bedford has a very high Portuguese population, and many of those people are here because of immigration. And so a lot of people who attended Portuguese feasts there have let me know that he comes every year and is just so pompous and very certain that he's welcomed in those spaces, but is very unaware of how he brings so much harm and pain to those communities. The ACLU recently released about, I want to say, over 140 emails and correspondences between him and Stephen Miller. And within these correspondences, he, essentially is just continuously tattletaling on any service or resource that is being provided to support immigrants, whether they, whether or not they're undocumented. To me, that doesn't matter. But to him, he is trying to just essentially, it just seems like keep tabs on anything that is trying to support a population of people that he potentially just does not support, because he's essentially a white supremacist. For me, that's what it seems like. He benefits from working in these prisons. He wants to maintain these prisons. He benefits from having these agreements. And he is making no effort to actually hear what the community wants, and then individually decides that this facility should have these agreements and detain people. I don't know. I feel like maybe that was more of a rant than rather specifics about this individual, but
no. It sounds like there's quite a bit there, and the emails with Miller sound quite interesting. Andrew, you've done a lot of reporting on the ground. I know you know this issue better than I do, so take it away. What have I missed?
Sherrie, one of the strands that you've already mentioned and alluded to is your own identity, and it includes Indigenous identity, if I'm not incorrect.
My father's family identifies as being Indigenous to Puerto Rico, which I think is complicated, but is something that I respect in their proclamation of their identity.
Okay. My curiosity is that because Hodgson is just clearly tapping into this white nationalist nativism and putting it in the forefront of so much of his politics, I'm wondering what your own feelings are about that kind of juxtaposition that comes forward in the struggle between Indigenous identity as opposed to this white nationalist nativism, especially because indigeneity in the past few decades now has become a real internationalist current of thinking within radical politics.
Well, that's such a dense question to answer. Definitely something I've been thinking about, and also personally feel like I've been struggling, and I feel like I come from a place of wanting to understand why a person would act in such a way and feel that it is okay. And I know it comes from power and privilege and access, but I feel like I think you named something that I personally have been trying to reflect on every day and not even come to a complete answer or understanding. But what I can say is this juxtaposition is incredible. I think it's interesting that I'm going to be going through this court process, that I should be, I say this with sarcasm, but like grateful to have access to a court system where I can, fight these charges, but without any acknowledgement that I'm fighting a trespassing charge on property that does not belong to the state, that belongs to the indigenous people of that area, who did not give any agreements as to whether or not this facility should exist, who don't receive tax money from the facility being on their lands. And so I think about that often. I just think the charge of trespassing is something I think about every day. Is I'm being charged with walking onto land that doesn't belong to any of the people within that facility. And I also think that that's not something that I can use as an argument in court, which is also disgusting, that we can't have, an honest conversation about where all of these things are taking place. And also this other layer of, people from Rhode Island are being held in this facility, or who might not explicitly be from Rhode Island, but the Wyatt detention facility in Rhode Island isn't supposed to be holding residents of Rhode Island. So if they're an undocumented resident of Rhode Island, they would be held in a facility outside of Rhode Island. And so it's interesting that these people are being brought, across, in quotations, border into Massachusetts, where I personally cannot vote whether or not Sheriff Hodgson is in a sheriff position. I don't have a say as to whether or not he's in a position of power to make these policy decisions. I have to do something else. And for me, that is to use the only form of social capital I have, which is my body, which I think is something that people of color, indigenous people, black and brown people, for hundreds of thousands of years have had to do. They've had to put their body on the front lines to fight these systems of oppression, while people continue to tell us that there's a better way. There's a better way to be heard. There's a better way to be seen. And I feel that this entire action and this process is such a small microcosm of this history of white supremacy or fighting white supremacy and nationalism in the United States, white nativism or whatever. But I see all of these little elements being played out just throughout the entire process. So maybe not an entire answer, but definitely a scattered, many thoughts that I keep thinking about. And I don't know, would like to have this conversation with you in person, and maybe we can come with a more streamlined analysis on it. But it's something that I just keep struggling with, is all of these little connections that I keep making every day as I continue through this process, and also see how the court system treats other people who are going through there. Sorry, like I said, not an exact answer.
That was fantastic.
Something I think of.
That was glorious. There's also something you alluded to earlier, and we can explore it a little bit, with the fact that for lack of a better word, more eco-liberal kind of NIMBY brand of environmentalists really dropped the ball with the FANG Collective once you folks started to promote that you were taking on the immigration struggle. And I'm wondering, because environmentalism comes in America with a certain prominent strand that was basically ecology and conservationism, but promoted by somebody like Teddy Roosevelt. If any kind of connections or strands linking across between what we were just discussing with Hodgson's brand of nativism and that kind of NIMBYism jump to mind?
Yeah, I think thinking about the history, like you said, of environmentalism in the United States, definitely stemming from this place of conservation, like preserving these spaces for certain people to have access to them, for certain people to enjoy them, and also determining what that enjoyment looks like, whether it be hunting endangered animals or not actually having a deeper connection to the land and viewing yourself as part of the land, viewing and understanding that what happens to the land happens to you, but definitely from this, again, a place of consumption, a place of this is mine and I get to have it, I get to determine how it is protected, is something that still continues to radiate throughout the environmental movement. You know, this is my house, this is my property, I don't want this to be built because it'll decrease my property value. Not necessarily, I don't want this to be built because I don't want this to harm anybody or anything around here. This loss of connection to other individuals and the land is very interesting, but more so around protection for these things because I need to continue to exist. And I guess this is more philosophical. I think we live in a world where people can't imagine what it would be like if they weren't there, and how it's okay if you actually don't exist. And maybe that's, again, too deep or too much. I am a philosophy major, so I think about that often. But in terms of, I guess, with Sheriff Hodgson, I think it again permeates what feels like his thinking. I guess I can't speak for himself, but, you know, this is my facility. I determine what happens here. I have power and control over this space. And no one is going to tell me I don't. And no one is going to, fight against my power, because this is something that I've always had access to, and I've always been able to, inflict upon other people. I've always been able to be in a position where I have a say and determine what happens here. And also this, again, lack of connection to other people and other people's humanity, and wanting to create a better space for others that, doesn't involve building these places of isolation, that definitely has no place in healing or reconnection to community. It's just, I don't know, prisons are so disgusting to me. I don't understand how we've come to a place of thinking that the best way to solve any harm or problem within a community is to separate each other and keep people away from those who care for them, who could potentially support them in understanding the harms that maybe they caused, or the dismantling of capitalism, which is and white supremacy, which also leads many people into a facility where, they never did anything wrong and are just there. So maybe a ramble again, but yeah, I definitely see this connection between environmental liberalism, and also just the usage of direct action tactics within environmental spaces. I feel with the rise of the Sunrise Movement, I see a lot of people taking direct action without any acknowledgement about where these tactics came from, the history of these tactics, whether it was from white working class people or, black and brown people, the civil rights movement, even whether, I'm not talking about specifically nonviolent direct action, but direct action with the Young Lords and the Black Panthers creating their own systems, child care, health centers for their own communities, like no acknowledgement of the history of these tactics, where they came from, why they even exist. They didn't exist for us to force political. I don't feel like they weren't existing to, like, we need to pass these laws in a racist system to protect us and to protect the environment. I just think it's very interesting that these tactics are being used to believe that if we change laws, if we put in laws that, you know, maybe reflect our views and our perspectives on the environment and protecting the environment, which I think is also, I think it's important. But if we're not changing the entire system, we're still just protecting white people's property. We're not actually doing anything to protect everybody. Still don't know if that answered your question. We can talk about all these things in human, real life person.
No, that is great, and very powerful. So I guess I want to ask how you are just doing as a person, as an organizer, as an activist. How are you faring during this period? It's a high-stress moment, imaginably, for any person heading towards a trial. I
am definitely trying to ground myself and understand, you know, the goal of the campaign, and think about some of the things that you asked me on this call and process them myself or with other people, and just be grateful and continue to acknowledge the privilege I have of having a whole team of people supporting me when so many people go through processes like these without any support, and definitely taking time to understand how I want to continue to organize. I've been taking some steps back and really thinking about the past, 7 years that I've been participating and supporting FANG, and really being critical of myself and realizing that there's so much I still need to learn, and the ways in which I need to grow so that I can even be a better organizer for my community and for the people I care about, and people I don't even know yet. But yeah, I'm a Virgo, so I'm always a little critical of myself. So I think spending this time before trial being very critical of the ways I can do better, and trying to be around people I care about the most. So.
Gotcha. Are there any points you'd like to bring up in conclusion of this interview? Issues, topics, whatever?
I don't think so. I think if people are interested in getting involved, definitely check out our website, shutdownicenow.org or thefangcollective.org. And I don't know, I think I'm just grateful to have the opportunity to talk about things, and I'm thanking both of you for making space and time to talk to me. So thank you.
We are extraordinarily thank you for having you on this call. Listeners, Sherrie's trial is starting on January 7th, 2020, and you can support them in a number of concrete ways. Visit shutdownicenow.org. That's shutdownicenow.org to donate to their support fund, sign a letter of support, and become engaged with the campaign. Thanks for listening, and be sure to tune in next week. This is the Washington Babylon Podcast, hosted by Ken Silverstein and produced by Andrew Stewart.